Hi, on behalf of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, welcome to our review of the 2020 High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Let me introduce my co-panelists before we go over some housekeeping and dive into today's topic. Kaylee Taylor is the lead of our Geneva 2030 Ecosystem Initiative, and Eleonora Bonacosi is a Junior Project Officer with the Geneva 2030 Ecosystem Project. This project promotes collaboration and initiatives for Geneva-based actors focused on SDG implementation. I'm Dr. Lynn Wagner, the Senior Director of the Tracking Progress Program at IISD, where we have a number of projects that seek to enhance the accountability of decision-making for the SDGs, enhance engagement in SDG implementation, and develop SDG indicator and reporting tools. So welcome. We're really looking forward to the discussion today. First, a few housekeeping notes. We'd like to know who you are. A poll has just appeared on your screen asking which region you're from, which sector you represent. It will really help us to know the variety and the backgrounds of people on this call. So please take a moment to fill it in. The chat function is open. Please keep your comments professional, but for the webinar today, please use the Q&A function to submit your observations and questions and to vote up others' questions. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end to go over your questions. We're aiming for about an hour, so about 40 minutes of our presentation, more or less, and then 20 minutes to take up the comments at the end. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that ISD has a number of resources that we encourage you to be sure that you're using and subscribe to. The SDG Knowledge Hub, sdg.isd.org, offers stories every week on SDG implementation efforts around the world. Our Earth Negotiations Bulletin coverage goes into the meetings. We've had a team watching the HLPF from start to finish and summarizes these reports for you. So go to the report, emb.isd.org to find these reports. It provides a really nice, concise, brief summary of each day. Our team right now is writing on the summary issue, which will include an analysis. So we'd encourage you to see that. It'll come out on Monday of their take of what this HLPF means for the Sustainable Development Agenda. So with that, I'd like to launch into our topics. We're going to be talking about how did the first virtual HLPF go? What themes and challenges emerged for SDG implementation? And where does the 2030 agenda go next? Right before we get into the topic, I wanted to go over a few numbers that we just received from DESA. So 72,000 viewers online, with the largest single session being 12,411 on the opening day. This is rather significant in the middle of July, this many people, that there was real hunger for this meeting, for this convening event. 47 voluntary national reviews were presented. And a companion to the official sessions, 17 VNR labs took place with the different participants, or to provide a in-depth view of different elements of VNRs, how they worked, how they don't work, how to refocus and focus, what the different VNRs were saying to us this year. 240 plus site events, plus 9 special events. There was no lack of topics, issues to follow, to learn about different organizations' SDG related activities. There were 10 online exhibitions, including a SDG Media Zone, and 150 speakers involved in the thematic sessions, with head of state, deputies, heads of state, ministers, and then the high-level segment. There were two heads of state, and again, representation from deputy heads of state and ministers. So while this was a virtual event, it was a very robust and there were a lot of people around the world engaged in this event. Kind of with that scene setting, I'd like to introduce Eleonora, who's going to pick up the first topic of how the first virtual HLPF went.
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning and good evening to everyone. I'm not sure I can see the results of the first question. I don't know if everyone else can see this. Okay, so yes, I mean, we are watching from all around the world. So thank you for joining us, especially after this quite intense HLPF. So thank you for making the time. I think before starting to share my comments, my observation on how this first virtual HLPF went, I would like to hear from you. So maybe let's go to the next poll. And if Matthew, if you can please ask the second question. So the question is indeed, how was for you to follow the HLPF in the virtual format? Okay. Yes, I think before closing this poll, I can already start by giving my observation. I mean, we all observed since the beginning of the pandemic this huge shift from in-presence meeting to online meeting. And this was a big experiment for everyone, including the United Nations. So, and including the UN, which successfully managed to hold its first virtual HLPF completely online. However, I mean, this shift was already anticipated by the 5 UN regional commissions, whose annual forums were held online, except for one, the African one, and then were all held online, and their format also was shorter than the usual meeting because of the pandemic. So we already have the results of the second question. And okay, it seems that yeah, it was somewhat easy and easy. Some of you also mentioned that it was hard to follow. I have to say that from my perspective, it was also, given the time difference, it was easy to follow this online meeting because of the recording that were made available on soon after they were the session were over. So yes, okay, I'll start. I think it was a huge coordination effort and in such a short time, and I mentioned already the time differences. Yes, this was a huge test for the UN and for multilateralism. Of course, we all saw these some technical glitches, but if we consider the high number of speakers and the intervention over the 8 days of the HLPF, I think we can say that the amount of technical issues was relatively low. So yeah, great work done by UNDESA, the Department of Conference Management, and also the Information and Communication Technology services for pulling this together, and despite the difficult situation. The second theme I will touch on is the one of accessibility and inclusion. The number that the statistic that Lynn mentioned speaks quite a lot about this virtual meeting. Indeed, there was no limit to the number of persons who can follow the discussion through the UN webcast. And as I mentioned already, the webcasts were recorded. So compared to the limited availability of in-presence meeting and side events, which is limited, of course, due to logistical reasons, I think this was quite a huge positive thing. Of course, one of the challenges that was mentioned a lot during the first days of the HLPF and also during the voluntary national review was the issue of the IT capacity and access, that it's not the same for everyone. And also, which is an issue of this digital divide, is an issue that is essential to address, to ensure that no one is left behind, especially in this moment where everything is online. Indeed, a participant, I am quoting a participant that noted that even internet access could be meaningless without meaningful participation. Now I'll touch on the inclusion aspect. I think there was quite a good feature to make inclusion inclusion possible. Indeed, there was the real-time captioning feature that helps people with hearing impairments, and also, I mean, those who have difficulty in understanding meeting languages. And generally speaking, I mean, I found it very useful to have this visual support, especially as we all are aware that during the online meeting, the attention span is lower. Then again, the recorded session as well were also useful to go back and listen to those statements again. Side events as well were broadcasted on the UN TV, but for the most part was the responsibility of each of the organizers to broadcast those events, and most of them made those available through social media. Yeah, I mean, I also spoke with friends, and in general, I mean, people also had some difficulties to catch up with recordings, mentioning as well this fatigue that we all know about virtual meetings, in addition to each of our daily tasks. But at the same time, I think the positive side is that these videos are there whenever we need it. Then there was also another interesting feature before that, actually, yes, the interpretation feature was available for the VNR's days. So this was quite a huge effort for the interpretation service, because also some of them are also working from home. And also we all experienced this technical difficulty, which made more difficult for interpreters to provide this service. This was provided in the 6 official languages of the UN. And also I noticed that some countries, when presenting their VNRs, included sign languages interpretation. In terms of interaction, I'm going to attendances and interactions. This year, given the virtual nature of the meeting, VNR countries have chosen whether to present their VNR via live streaming or through pre-recorded presentation or through a mix of both. So I think, again, this is good for the time zone difference, for visual support, and also it gives more flexibility. Those VNR statements were followed by an interactive dialogue with a country's representative, and there was indeed a specific time after the panelists spoke that was available only to those WebEx registered participants, which expressed their interest to take the floor in advance. But at the same time, for those who didn't express this interest, there was also the opportunity to do so through a form that was circulated during the specific meeting. And the question and the time allocated for question and comments for the audience was up to 2 minutes. So it happened that sometimes there was not enough time to go through those question and answers. So so yeah, I mean, there was this willingness as well from countries to reply by written responses after the HLPF session. Yes, but at this, yeah, I think at the same time, when countries presented those VNRs, there was a huge variance in terms of pre-recorded statement. Some played well without technical issues, other with some technical issues. But I think we can say that this can be a huge lesson learned for the UN, especially ahead of the next UN. A UN General Assembly session, which will take place in September, where member states will present their opening statements. And probably by then, those technical issues will be solved or mitigated. And let's see if there will be any other tools that will be used to address those issues. In terms of the VNRs, I didn't notice a huge change except for this video pre-recorded statement, but the length was more or less the same. I don't know if Lynn and Kelly, if you have any thoughts on that, but I think overall there was a good opportunity to intervene, especially also for the civil society organization were included. As you may be familiar, there was a letter of 460 civil society organizations that signed this letter asking for meaningful inclusion, recalling the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' statement from April on the importance of promoting and protecting the civic space in response to COVID-19. Yes, the observation, question, and comments from civil society were included. And especially, I think I noticed active engagement from the youth, from the women and indigenous people, both at the VNRs, but also in terms of side events organization. Then, yeah, I mean, I guess then it will be the final say. It's also it will be to the civil society organization, because indeed they indeed asked in this letter that at least 3 responses for major group were part of each VNR presentation. Also to publish the Shadows VNR's report on the official HLPF website, and to receive a written answer on those questions that they asked during the VNRs within a month of that presentation. So let's see how this will go. Yes, I think this is it on my side. Maybe my colleagues want to say something on this. Lynn, do you have something to add?
Yeah, maybe, and just kind of maybe a segue from your discussion, Eleanor, to Kaylee's, is that the fact that this was all online, I think, really drove and pushed the theme of digitization forward, that we're realizing in this virtual world that really does need to be addressed, to be sure that there's equal access, and to really use the benefits that full digitization, around the world could bring to the sustainable development field.
And, from a personal perspective, as a professional who normally goes to the HLPF but was following it from afar, I think it is more difficult to create the space for a full 8 days when you have other competing priorities in the office versus being there. But of course, that's balanced with the fact that so many more people could participate meaningfully. So you have these pros and cons, and also the program page of the DESA website, the HLPF website. I think they were able to put more effort into recording each video with each session, so it's easier to follow up now, and I recommend checking out that page. Lynn, maybe before we move to my section, there was a quick question about the ministerial declaration. Could you give us a quick update on what happened there? You're on mute.
The HLPF usually ends with a the adoption of a ministerial declaration that has been negotiated at the UN. The negotiations began before the HLPF and have often gone down to the wire, even in the in-person events. As if you were watching yesterday, you know the ministerial declaration negotiations did not conclude. So the HLPF did not end with a ministerial declaration. It was held up on some issues that have held up previous ministerial declarations, looking at sustainable development possibilities in areas of conflict, the occupied territories. And so the ECOSOC president is going to continue the negotiations on that topic. And so if you watch the SDG Knowledge Hub, we'll follow the talks and let you know what happens with that.
Perfect, thanks. And so I can move on with some of the content and what we saw in terms of the themes and challenges that arose in this particular HLPF. The first thing I would say is this HLPF covered a lot of ground. It was the first one where there wasn't a subset of goals, and it was more all-encompassing. And COVID was obviously central at the HLPF. Matt, if you could just throw up that slide, that'd be great. And the entire agenda of the HLPF was revisited to incorporate the COVID situation once we were addressing this current health and economic crisis caused by the pandemic. The statistical report and speeches throughout the forum underscored that many goals have backslid notably. These include that 71 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty. There was a surge in violence against women and girls in lockdowns. Of course, there have been mass job losses and disruptions to education. Hunger has been exacerbated because of multiple threats in agricultural supply chains and other issues like locusts and climate change, all compounding on that. And then overall, this has just really highlighted where there's inequalities globally and made that extremely clear and prevalent. It was noted many times that there's a great threat of losing decades of progress, and that the forum encouraged all stakeholders to work together to prevent losing more ground, while also thinking about building the systems that will address those systemic vulnerabilities that were exposed by COVID. So how do we deal with, protecting that progress that we made, while also thinking about how we leapfrog ahead. In terms of tangible themes and takeaways that I noticed, the number one word that stood out, and I was texting this with other people who were watching, was the word solidarity. We saw it constantly, and it was this notion that we all need to come together. I think this is something that we have seen to a degree in past HLPFs, but this was really, really clearly because this pandemic is a global issue that has affected us all. And this was complemented with many, many calls for renewed multilateralism and inclusive development, as well as we move from this crisis management to recovery and then to long-term planning. A big moment for me, or a moment that I felt was quite important, was the Secretary General's speech, because he was very direct in saying that countries' lack of progress on the SDGs to date only exacerbated the suffering and challenges that were faced in the pandemic, and had we maybe had more progress, perhaps we could have mitigated some of those issues. So it's yet another need for the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda. Of course, he also noted that it's not too late to turn it around, and that was a nice pairing with the Decade of Action, which launched in January 2020. So I think that this is a big theme that will continue as we move forward. As I mentioned before, this was the first HLPF where there was no subset of goals reviewed, but rather these cross-cutting themes. And for those of you who followed past years, this came from the Global Sustainable Development Report, but of course was adapted to the COVID situation. And I think this is a positive development, that we're thinking more systemically and not going into buckets of goals and silos, but it's just a balance of how we, of course, then give each goal and all the data and things that are collected about it its adequate time. And I think we'll continue to see these more cross-cutting themes in future HLPFs, but it's still to be determined. And I think Lynn will talk about that in her section. I think the leave one known behind mantra was very strong because, again, inequalities have been a huge part of this pandemic. And there was very much a focus on social protections for addressing leave no one behind. And I'm hoping that that conversation goes a little bit further to look also at the economic, environmental, and other levers that can be used in order to address that principle so that we get a more holistic view of it. But leave no one behind came up a lot, and it is my hope that we get to some more solutions on that as we move forward. A big area of discussion, of course, was the economic consequences of the pandemic. And that makes sense because this is what all countries have been dealing with in addition to the health crisis. But what I found really interesting is it wasn't just blanket statements on these impacts. It was rather a focus on how these impacts are affecting different contexts in different countries. So I'll give a couple examples. The first is SIDS. SIDS painted a very strong picture of the physical isolation and reliance on tourism and how hard that's made both the health and economic response. And I think that was really important because it showed that we have to sometimes give special attention to countries who have interesting contexts or contexts to deal with that are different from other countries. In addition, many middle-income countries noted that the relief and concessional finance available is mostly for least developed countries and does not necessarily consider the levels of vulnerability more broadly, and therefore they're not eligible, and that might not be applicable in a situation like a pandemic and might need to be revisited. There were also a lot of conversations about debt servicing, official development assistance, and I thought to a somewhat lesser degree than other HLPFs, the extent of the role of private finance. I thought it was a little bit more of a public finance and debt aid discussion this time than in previous HLPFs, although that has been a theme across all of them. So finance was a big theme across the board. Another theme that we were watching very closely was that this was meant to be the super year for nature because several of the biodiversity targets were expiring and need to be revisited, as well as the Conference on Biological Diversity in China upcoming, which has now been postponed. But because these factors were at play, we were watching very closely how this nature and biodiversity theme would show up in the forum. So from my perspective and going through all the reports and watching everything, environment was definitely generally a present theme. Climate change was brought up in many instances and I thought was quite present in the VNRs. But generally, given the context that we were in and that we thought this was meant to be the super year for nature, I did feel that the biological diversity and nature theme was somewhat muted. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out as we move into 2021 and the CBD will be rescheduled. But I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts were in the chat or in the discussion. I thought that the major groups added great perspective to the conversations. The youth voice was very strong, as were, of course, women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and CSOs. Eleanor has already mentioned that, but I thought they very much added an important texture to the conversation, and they were some very great interventions, so that was great to see. And a couple last themes that I won't go into too in depth, but just that I noticed as well were there was a lot of discussion about cities and local implementation and the voluntary local reviews. So that was good to see the agenda translating down from the global level right into local communities. There was a discussion about data systems and unfortunately the lack of data that's available. Although I would say that's been stronger in past HLPFs, it remains an ongoing theme that we're dealing with. And so I saw that come up a few times. And then finally, technology, which both in terms of the actual event, but also the fact that technology has the potential to either advance development and inclusion or create bigger gaps. And this is something that I think that tension between how we utilize technology, ensure that it becomes a force for reducing inequality rather than exacerbating it, was very, very present. So those were the big themes I saw. Eleonora or Lynn, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. Just in terms of thinking about the difficult job for setting the theme for the next HLPF sessions. Based on what you said, that we started the 2030 agenda back in the HLPFs in 2016, 2017. We focused on individual clusters of individual SDGs. And then the GSDR report, I think, has definitely, galvanized the thinking around transformative actions and the thinking about the topics in combination, the SDGs and the interactions. In it, it's going to be a challenge, I think, setting the agendas for the next HLPFs, because we all recognize that you can't just talk about one SDG without bringing in all the others. And how do you do that? And I think that came out in a initiative by the women's group that was concerned that SDG 5 wasn't going to be included in a proposed agenda for the next HLPF. That, how could you discuss these other issues without talking about gender?
Eleanor, anything you'd like to add? Okay, great. So now
you covered very well.
So now I'll pass it over to Lynn to continue with that theme of where we're going in the future with the HLPF.
Yep. So I think just carrying on from what I was just saying and what you had said, Kaylee, the agenda, setting the agenda for the next HLPFs will be a really important topic and something to keep in mind and to watch. There had been the hope before the pandemic that would be settled by this HLPF. The next 4 years agendas would be settled, but that was put on the back burner. With the SDG Knowledge Hub, of course, we'll be following what's going on, and we'll bring you news about what is decided and opportunity, to the extent possible, show you where the opportunities are to provide input. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. This slide has a number of events, the next kind of convening events for global discussions on these issues. Big focus will be in September. I think, as Eleanor said, this HLPF in some ways was seen as the trial run, the test case for the opening of the UNGA in September. The General Assembly opening is traditionally a very big point in the annual cycle for the UN, and doubly so this year because it's the 75th anniversary of the UN. It's going to be the first SDG moment. What that's going to look like is still or still hasn't been announced, but the Secretary General announced last year at the HLPF under UNGA auspices that he wanted to host an annual SDG moment at the UNGA so that the SDGs remain on the agenda when all the heads of state around the world are coming together to think about what the UN's role in the world is. Beijing Plus 25 is going to look at it's the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women, which took place in Beijing. But so there'll be a big focus on gender issues around that. And then there's going to be a biodiversity summit at during the opening of the UNGA. As Eleanor noted, this is again going to need to be virtual. And so in many ways, the VNRs were kind of a test run for the maybe much higher stakes when the head of state is giving a prepared statement. And so we'll be watching that. Earth Negotiations Bulletin will again be following that virtually and bringing you summaries of what's happening to track where it's almost like the beginning of the school year. September is always the beginning of the UNGA year, where everyone's laying out what their agenda is and what they see the priorities are. So it's a really important point. And especially since this year, so many events haven't taken place as expected. So that's the right-hand column of events. Convention on Biological Diversity was supposed to happen this year. Just this week, the new dates were announced. It's now scheduled for May. The WTO Ministerial Conference was supposed to happen. It's postponed until next year. All of these are events that will have some input to some of the targets that had 2020 dates. The International Conference on Chemicals Management is going to decide on the future of the chemicals management regime, which collaboration on chemicals management, that also had a 2020 date. The World Data Forum was going to, brings together people from around the world to talk about data challenges. Big items on the agenda would be the 2020 censuses around the world, what's happening with those. And also data collection was fast-tracked with the 2020 date, recognizing the importance of getting that indicator data to help drive the agenda. The Glasgow Climate Change Conference is also the annual Climate Change Conference is a key item on the annual agenda that was pushed off till next year as well. So the preparations and lead up to all of those events will really be important to watch, and particularly with regard to the input and the ideas around those targets with 2020 dates. At this bottom level, it's no reflection of the importance, and maybe it's just the reflection of that this is the base on which we are all working, is that action at the local level, which, as Kaylee said, came out again and again during this HLPF. The VLRs, voluntary local reviews, are really catching on. There are I think as of this HLPF, a third guideline book was written for helping local communities develop VLRs. And then just kind of as a placeholder for one discussion of this local level action, it was announced during the HLPF that there's going to be a forum on mayors taking place in Geneva I think it's in October. So that'll be one place to look to see where the local level leadership is coming from and what the local level is saying their challenges are, how they're finding the SDG implementation process, and where they could use some help. So with that, I guess, Kaylee and Eleanor, before we turned over to questions and comments, do you have any other comments on the road forward?
Yes, I just have some comment on the UN World Data Forum. I mean, the data issue was mentioned a lot in these VNRs. The forum, the in-presence participation will be postponed to next year, but at the same time, they will hold virtual days next October.
Right.
So
yeah, no, that's
ahead
important.
of that forum.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And yes.
Nothing to add here. Maybe we go to Matt and see what kind of questions we have coming in.
Thank you all for submitting your observations in the chat and in the Q&A. The first question we're going to start with, that's been upvoted the most. In your view, did the 2020 HLPF help to understand what Build Back Better could mean in practical terms?
It's a really good question. I think one of the struggles of any of these events, and I saw it also being brought up in the chat, that often the VNRs focus on the positives and what's been happening versus kind of the challenges and these types of things, painting ourselves in a good light, so to speak. I think the challenge with any of these is, with short time to say, it's hard to really get out very tangible examples and these types of things in a way that really helps to paint a picture of what Building Back Better could look like. But I do think there were some really good examples, and unfortunately there were some, I think, troubling examples. For example, the Secretary General brought up that fossil fuels have received more assistance in terms of economic recovery than renewables, for example. So while there, I think conceptually is this idea of what Building Back Better means, to be more inclusive, to be climate resilient, to think about how we want to support and provide social protection for people. I'm not sure that that's how things are developing, and I think it will take some analysis afterwards to figure out what that exactly looks like. So I would say it was mildly successful. There was a lot of really interesting examples, but in terms of a really tangible roadmap or something, I don't think we got there at this HLPF. Lynn, I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, well, I guess so. One example of one of the events that I attended that might fit this, and I saw another question came up about water. The water, UN Water coordinated the development of what they call a SDG 6 accelerator framework, which was launched last week with over 600 participants tuning into this event. And I think it really did symbolize the recognition of this need to really work at the country level and find out, what the individual challenges are and where to work. So this accelerator framework is it's focused on working with the UN country level coordinators and helping them to tap into the UN expertise on water and sanitation, and work with the local communities, the local governments, to identify what their specific needs are and how to leverage the expertise of the UN for those specific needs of the country. And so I think more of those types of bridging efforts to, bring from this grand rhetoric or objectives stated at a HLPF session to well, what does this really mean on the ground? What are those specific challenges? That moving more in that direction is how we're going to get to that better situation after this pandemic. And
maybe just to add to that, the other thing that was launched during the HLPF or just before was this platform of actions by DESA to record actions that can be taken. And I think, when we're thinking about very tangibly how we move things ahead, good examples really help. So I think that if that gets well populated and can start to provide really good examples, we can start to have some of those kind of roadmaps. And as Lynn said, start to implement them in countries.
An observation and a question that came up was whether or not the numbers that we shared that we got from DESA had a breakdown either by age or by region to show whether or not this was not only well attended virtually, but representative of the world population. We don't have that right now. These are just the broad numbers. And thank you very much for sharing that observation, because obviously if the attendance is concentrated in one region, then while this may have been well attended virtually, it might not have been well attended equitably. So thank you for making that point. And we'll look to see if there is a breakdown of these numbers by region and by further demographics. Another question that's been well upvoted. Under SDG 14, there are several targets which come to an end in 2020. What is the procedure behind the SDG 14 targets? Which organization should I follow for the next decade's SDG 14 targets?
Well, so one of them is on fisheries subsidies and the WTO negotiations, which are ongoing, and they've been going on for what, about 20 years, Eleonora? And
yes,
there's,
Yes, target 14.6. So you can follow the WTO fishery subsidies negotiations on this.
Yeah, but I think that there's an expectation that there may be some agreement, right, Eleonora?
Yes, I think so. And we all know the ministerial conference MC12 was supposed to take place this year, but of course it got postponed. Yeah, let's see by the end of this year, or if there is indeed an agreement on target 14.6. Yes.
Yeah, but so I guess just maybe our back and forth indicates that we have colleagues who, and Eleanor's working with them, who are following the fisheries subsidies negotiations in the WTO. And so we will be bringing that news to you as we get it in the SDG Knowledge Hub. And contact us if you have further questions, and we can try to answer you. Just I guess in looking at the other, I guess I'm not sure where the other 2020 targets are going to be addressed.
So maybe something to add here is there was meant to be a large oceans conference in Lisbon this year, and it was postponed. And the most up-to-date information, I just popped it in the chat, but the most up-to-date information at this point is that it's the process and procedure is still being determined. So I think that this is something where we'll have to keep an eye on it, and I recommend keeping an eye on this Ocean Conference's website, but also the SDG Knowledge Hub, because we do cover these things as they come up, but it seems like it's still in flux, as many of these conferences that got postponed are. I would say that I'm not even sure I heard oceans mentioned at all during this HLPF. I'm sure it did somewhere other than in the context of SIDS, but so I think this is something that will probably get picked up again next year.
A number of people have made the observation that as well as creating a platform for inclusion, because it was a virtual event, the carbon footprint for this conference was assumably the lowest that it's ever been. And a number of comments on whether or not this should just continue as a policy because of the opportunity to attend from around the world and because of the environmental benefits. I wonder if each of you could share some thoughts as people who have both attended the HLPF, but also a number of other conferences, of the virtues of in-person meetings, for finding resolution and thinking perhaps about the ministerial declaration, versus the virtues that a number of people have pointed out about inclusion and a low carbon footprint.
Yeah, I think, Matt, you kind of were already hinting at it. I think we saw what can happen sometimes if there isn't the opportunity for that in-room negotiation. We didn't make it to a ministerial declaration, and Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've always had a ministerial declaration out of the HLPF. So this is the first time that wasn't able to happen. So, I think your point about the low carbon emissions is very good, and also the fact that it makes it easier for people, accessibility and people to attend. I think the answer is probably some sort of hybrid, like most things in this world, where it's somewhere in the middle, where I think the huge amount of work that DESA put into making sure that all the sessions were available and matched with their program point, and all the side events were listed. I mean, they always had a good website, but it was particularly well linked with the online, made it easier for people to follow online, and that should probably continue. But I think there will need to be some level of in-person participation. I think another thing that is part of this is that it is quite challenging, to follow, like I mentioned, as a professional, just to follow that much content in an online format. It's hard to follow in person as well, because it's a lot of content, but when you're there, you're more in it, you're running into the people at the halls, you're having those conversations, you're reflecting. So I think there's pros and cons to both, but I think that what we can take from this is the accessibility is a huge, huge addition and very important, and that we need to have some sort of kind of hybrid. I'm not sure, Lynn and Eleonora, what you think.
Yeah, no, when the side events that I attended, had 100, 600 people, you wouldn't get that in person in the UN basement. And so from that respect, it opened up, and it allowed new audiences to participate in this. In terms of especially the negotiation of the ministerial declaration or any negotiation, there are certain things that the negotiators are figuring out how to negotiate through what they call the silence procedure, where you know, there are drafts passed around and then they have a deadline by which they can say yes or no, or I guess it's called breaking the silence, so that they would say, no, we don't accept that. So then a new draft has to get developed and a new deadline is set. And that has worked, and the UN has been using it, especially for a number of procedural decisions that need to be taken. But when you get down to some of the core, you know, disputes, the core elements, you need to have that face-to-face. I mean, you know, that we're social people, diplomats need to have that they develop that relationship with their counterparts. You need to know that the meeting was open and that, you know, all countries had the opportunity to have a representative there, and that can be more difficult in a virtual platform. So that there are certain things that will need to have, you know, the face-to-face, and hopefully, you know, within a year or so, we will be able to go back to that face-to-face. But I think, as Kaylee said, that we've discovered that there is an opportunity and a different way of interacting and reaching out through these virtual platforms as well.
Yes, I just want to say, I mean, you both gave valid points on that. I mean, on the side events, I mean, the HLPF was quite dense. So imagine being there and you couldn't follow all the 200 and plus side events, 9 special events, VNR lab. So I think the fact of having this online, you can go back to this whenever you have time, and do and attend the side events. Most of them are available on the social media of the organizers. So and also some in the HLPF website. So if you have a look at that, you can definitely see the benefit of hosting online meeting. So yeah, this is my point on that.
Just have a few minutes left. We will look to try and answer the questions that we don't get to in a follow-up email. But an important one that we should discuss, in your opinion, are the quality of voluntary national reviews improving?
This is a really good question. So I also spoke to DESA about this, and they feel very much that the quality is improving. I would differentiate between the quality of the presentations and the quality of the VNR process, which are two very different things. I think that we can only expect so much out of 15 minutes and a few questions. I mean, this is just the reality of being able to open up to multiple countries to present a VNR. What I think really matters, and this is something that's very dear to IISD's heart because we work quite closely with the Partners for Review, is that the voluntary national review process is something that is about the whole process of doing the review, the actual meeting and the presentation, and then the follow-up that comes after that in continuing to engage with the stakeholders that are engaged in the original process, and how any things that are found are followed up on and addressed. And I think that that's come a long way. As was mentioned, I think by Eleonora, there's also been a lot of new guidance on the VNRs, and these VNR labs allow for a safe space to talk about this and get more sophisticated. So I think undoubtedly the entire process has improved. I think we just have to mitigate expectations around the actual presentations, because it's just, there's time constraints and they can only really do so much in 15 minutes. But what I think really matters is the longer term process, and that's definitely improving.
Yes, on that, I'd like to say something. I mean, I have been listening to some of the VNR's presentation, and most of them have mentioned the inclusive approach of involving different stakeholders in the different consultation phases of the production of this VNR. So I think this is something that, yeah, it's something that is improving since the first VNRs, and also the issues of leaving no one behind, which is indeed linked to the inclusive process of this VNR. So in terms of preparation, but also in terms of the follow-up of this VNR, involving all the stakeholders in the actual implementation of the voluntary national review. So yeah, this is my point on that.
Okay, so thank you so much for those questions. As Matt said, that's been Matt ten Bruggencott in the background. We'll be looking at your questions and following up. Reach out to us, please, if you have any questions that weren't answered. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us to think about what these last 8 days meant. Congratulations again to the UN for going ahead and not reducing the HLPF to a half-day event, given the circumstances. That I think there's a real hunger and want to engage. I mean, the fact that there were 240 site events, that we have brought together 140 people today on a Friday evening for many of you. Thank you for, tuning in. We look forward to your comments as you process what these last 8 days have meant. And so thank you very much. As you leave, there'll be a poll asking you for your thoughts on the webinar. We'd really like to know, how this helped you with your work, what we could do better to help you with your work. And have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.